Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore the astonishing achievements of perhaps the greatest of all the world's historic civilizations, ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egypt probably represents the longest-lived single civilization in human history, and during that time produced some of the greatest monuments created and which still exist.
Extraordinary buildings, hieroglyphs, gold, mummies. All of this is a really heady combination, a really attractive package that appeals in a way that other civilizations just can't quite manage.
It was an extraordinarily successful civilization. In the essentials, things were stable and enduring over 3,000 years. You think the British Empire was great? It didn't last very long, did it? And what has? You know, in some ways, there's nothing that comes close.
Rising to prominence in North Africa along the fertile valley of the River Nile, ancient Egypt prospered and grew to become one of the world's earliest and greatest civilizations. In this episode, we'll travel through time to appreciate 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history through the amazing stories of 10 of its most famous and spectacular buildings. It's a journey of discovery that will take us to ancient Egypt's greatest pyramids and obelisks, and its most magnificent temples and tombs. Our story starts 100 years or so before the building of the Great Pyramids of Giza. Nearly 5,000 years old and over 200 feet high, the step pyramid beneath which the Pharaoh Djoser was buried is undoubtedly one of ancient Egypt's most significant and magnificent monuments.
The step pyramid represents the first major building in stone in human history.
This is a landmark monument for humankind.
And remarkably, for a building nearly 5,000 years old, we even know the name of the architect who built it, Imhotep.
Actually, you know, the step pyramid, it's something incredible. We have to thank the architect Imhotep a lot, because before Imhotep, this architect, everything was built from mud bricks. And you know, mud bricks, it doesn't exist for a long time. Imhotep, he's a genius architect.
Until Imhotep, Egypt's pharaohs had been buried very simply in small, single-story mud brick tombs known as mastabas, most of which haven't survived until today. Stone-built mastabas do still survive, and Imhotep's genius was not only to be the first to use stone, so the pharaoh's tomb would last for eternity, but also to make the huge leap of imagination of turning an initially single-story stone mastaba into a multi-story pyramid.
And this time, in the third dynasty, the power of the king was increased. So Imhotep, he wanted to make his king happy and satisfied, to build something huge for him. One mastaba, it wasn't big enough for a king, for a god. So he added to the sides to enlarge the mastaba, and after this he built the second step, the third, you know, fourth, fifth, sixth, to get 6 steps. Why steps? Because he believed after the death, the soul wanna climb the pyramid to the heaven.
Despite being designed as a stairway to heaven for the pharaoh's soul, the mummified body of the dead Pharaoh Djoser wasn't actually buried inside the step pyramid. Instead, he was buried underneath it.
We found a shaft was cut in the rock for 28 meters deep to a huge burial chamber. Guess what? We found in the burial chamber a huge sarcophagus. It's about 40 tons. The question now, how they can lower 40-ton sarcophagus for 28 meters deep? There's no technology. There is no machines. Nothing at all. So this genius architect, what he did to lower down the sarcophagus, he cut 2 side shafts, parallel to the main shaft, and connected from down with the king chamber. And what he did, he filled, the king chamber with sands. He filled the main shaft with sands. He put the sarcophagus at the top, and he took the sands out from those subsidiary shafts. And the sarcophagus went down until it was rested at the bottom.
The pharaoh's mummy would then have been placed inside the sarcophagus before the tomb, containing everything he would need in his afterlife, was sealed for eternity. Taking perhaps 20 years to build, Imhotep's step pyramid was a remarkable achievement of both imagination and construction. But within less than 100 years, the ancient Egyptian architects went much further. Over 4,500 years old, the Great Pyramid of Giza is almost certainly the world's most famous and recognizable ancient monument. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, it's the only one still standing today.
Great Pyramid obviously was a great wonder of its time, but it endures as a great monument, certainly throughout Egyptian history, but right throughout ancient history and down to the present day.
Originally nearly 500 feet high, well over twice the height of the Step Pyramid, remarkably, it was the world's tallest building for over 3,500 years, until the building of medieval cathedrals. And it's still a record holder today.
The Great Pyramid of Giza is still the most massive freestanding building ever created, and to have that kind of record maintained for over 4,000 years is not bad.
Built as the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu, otherwise known as Cheops, the Great Pyramid stands next to another huge pyramid, later built for his son Khafre, and a third, smaller pyramid built for his grandson. Together, the pyramids of Giza are such an astonishing achievement of ancient construction that there are all sorts of wild theories about them.
Who were the builders of the pyramids? Because we heard many theories about aliens, Atlantis people from outer space. They can build the pyramid. Actually, the builders were the Egyptians. In winter, River Nile flooded all Egypt with water, and the majority of the Egyptians were farmers. They stayed in their houses without work. The king brought them, used them in building the pyramid.
If you imagine a world where there aren't newspapers and there isn't the internet, and you don't have a lot of distractions, and you do have a common idea of divinity, then with some basic key principles of organisation, you can organise tens of thousands of people to do essentially what the king wants, or what it's perceived the gods want.
We had a great discovery. In 1990, American tourist was riding a horse in the desert, and the leg of the horse fell down in a hole. So what we did excavation. We just cleaned the sands. We found the workers' tombs, the builders of the pyramid tombs. Between the workers' tombs, we found something amazing. We found a tomb for a doctor. A doctor? Some people say it, building a pyramid by slaves. So if you had slaves, why? You need a doctor to treat them. You can throw them away and bring more and more slaves. Actually, they weren't slaves. They were workers. And we give them salaries, beer, bread, and salted fish. And this doctor to treat those workers. Everybody was participating to build a pyramid for a god.
Where, to us, perhaps, the idea of slogging around in the heat, moving massive blocks might seem like a bit of a nuisance, and, there must have been better jobs. We have to bear in mind that in the Egyptian mindset, Pharaoh is a god, and the construction of something like the Great Pyramid is the single greatest thing you could be involved in.
The scale of the workers' achievement in building the Great Pyramid for their pharaoh Khufu is certainly staggering. It's constructed of more than 2 million blocks of stone, weighing an average of 2.5 tons each, while some blocks are as heavy as 60 tons. How on earth was such huge stones moved? There are many different theories, but the most widely accepted idea is that a massive ramp was used.
They make a ramp from sands, and this ramp goes up in a circular way around the pyramid. They have sledges, and they put the blocks in the sledges. Those sledges were pulled by oxes, and they take the blocks up course by course, level by level, until they reach the top of the pyramid. It takes about 20 years to build this pyramid. 20,000 of workers. It's incredible.
When they were first completed, all of the Giza pyramids were smooth-sided. But today, the original smooth outer casing stones remain only at the very top of Khafre's pyramid. All the other casing stones were stripped from the pyramids in medieval times to help build Cairo. So, what did the Giza pyramids really look like when they were first built, and Khufu's Great Pyramid in particular? It involves a leap of imagination, but since the Giza pyramid's smooth outer casing stones were made of dazzling white limestone, they would have been lit up like beacons beneath the bright Egyptian sun. Not only that, but according to some historical accounts, the Giza pyramid's topmost capstones, known as pyramidions, were covered with shining gold. With the Great Pyramid's pyramidion reflecting the sun back towards the heavens, any ancient Egyptians watching would surely have been in no doubt that their dead pharaoh's soul was using the sun's rays as a stairway to heaven. Unlike at the earlier step pyramid, the pharaoh Khufu's mummy, from which his soul would ascend, was buried not underneath the Great Pyramid, but inside it. The original entrance to Khufu's burial chamber, once secretly hidden beneath the outer casing stones, is now blocked, and today you enter the Great Pyramid via a lower opening that was made in the 9th century AD by a medieval caliph searching for buried treasure. At the end of the tunnel, cut in medieval times, a narrow 3-foot square corridor rises 130 feet towards the heart of the pyramid. Beyond it, a grand gallery, nearly 30 feet high, ascends 150 feet further, all the way up to the chamber where Khufu was entombed. Once overflowing with magnificent golden treasures to accompany the pharaoh to his afterlife, these were all robbed centuries ago. And today, the only thing that remains is the empty sarcophagus where Khufu's mummy was laid to rest 4,500 years ago. The Great Pyramids of Giza were such massive construction projects, requiring decades of labor by tens of thousands of workers, that they drained far too many resources to be repeatable by later pharaohs, who were content with much smaller pyramids for their tombs. In the end, however, the entire idea of building pyramids at all became discredited. They were much too obvious, an open invitation to tomb robbers who ransacked them all. 1,000 years later, at the height of ancient Egyptian civilization's power and magnificence, the pharaohs came up with a different idea to protect their tombs and the fabulous treasures buried within them. In a hidden gorge, today known as the Valley of the Kings, more than 20 pharaohs over a period of 500 years were buried in secretive rock-cut tombs, whose entrances were covered up to prevent tomb robbers from finding them. But as it turned out, all of the pharaohs' tombs here were found and robbed of their treasures. All that is, except one. After remaining successfully hidden for thousands of years, the entrance to the pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb was finally discovered by British archaeologist Howard Carter in November 1922.
For me, the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun is the most sensational archaeological discovery there's ever been by a very, very long way.
What Howard Carter saw when he first broke through the wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber exceeded an archaeologist's wildest dreams.
You think about the way that Hollywood has conceived archaeological discovery. Usually the visualization is of sort of entering a dusty and dark room and finding gold glinting everywhere. And as we all know, that never happens, except in the tomb of Tutankhamun. It did.
The tomb was absolutely packed with piles of treasure, everything Tutankhamun would need in his afterlife. At the center of the tomb, inside a stone sarcophagus, Carter found Tutankhamun's wooden coffin, painted with gold. Tutankhamun's mummy, with its head and shoulders covered by Carter's most sensational discovery, a spectacular solid gold mask, which is today almost certainly the world's most famous and iconic ancient treasure. Today, Tutankhamun's gold mask is on display in Cairo's Museum of Egyptian Antiquities, alongside numerous other spectacular treasures that Howard Carter found in Tutankhamun's tomb. This gorgeous gilded throne, for example, inlaid with precious stones, shows Tutankhamun being tenderly anointed with perfume by his wife. This small wooden box, topped with hieroglyphs spelling out Tutankhamun's name, was used to store a rich treasure trove of Tutankhamun's jewelry. Also found in Tutankhamun's tomb were a variety of objects intended to keep the pharaoh entertained, such as this checkerboard game.
Perhaps if the king was getting bored in the afterlife, he would play the game. But one has to understand that these are objects which had ritual meaning as well. They're not simply an easy way to idle away eternity. They may have a really serious practical function to enable the king to negotiate the afterlife.
The most important of all Tutankhamun's possessions that would enable him to thrive in his afterlife were originally stored in this beautiful golden shrine, which had inside it this small alabaster chest containing 4 jars. Inside them were some of Tutankhamun's internal organs, which had been removed during his mummification.
The organs which were actually separately preserved were the lungs, the stomach, the intestines and the liver. The heart was left inside the body, as it was the thing which they regard as being the seat of intelligence, and the kidneys because they were too difficult to get out.
According to ancient Egyptian belief, Tutankhamun's internal organs would be reunited with his mummy in the afterlife, allowing him to function as a normal person again. Today, as a mark of respect for the dead, Tutankhamun's mummy remains in his tomb. Despite dying well over 3,000 years ago, his hollow and dried-out mummy is still extremely well preserved, making it remarkably lifelike.
The Egyptians were constantly sort of refining the mummification process in order to preserve the remains as well as possible. The afterlife was forever. So it would have been no good to have preserved a body so that it lasted for 10 years after death or 100 years after death. It had to be forever, millions of years.
Although Tutankhamun is the only ancient Egyptian pharaoh whose mummy remains where he was originally buried, a number of other pharaohs' mummies are today preserved in Cairo's Museum of Egyptian Antiquities. This mummy, for example, is the famous Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, who inherited the throne around 50 years after Tutankhamun, and who is often described as the greatest of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs. Tall, with a strong jaw, aquiline nose and red hair, Ramesses the Great ruled for 66 years at the height of ancient Egyptian civilization's magnificence and power, and died at the grand old age of 90. During his lifetime, Ramesses the Great constructed more spectacular monumental buildings than any other pharaoh. Probably the most famous of all the temples he built is located in the remote far south of Egypt, close to the border with Sudan. A dramatic rock-cut temple carved out of a cliff face on Egypt's southern border, Abu Simbel was in principle dedicated to the ancient Egyptian sun god Re-Hirakte. But the most dominating aspect of the temple by far are its 4 gigantic statues of Ramesses the Great, which are each over 60 feet tall. Despite its religious function, the main purpose of Abu Simbel Temple was to ensure that foreigners passing this way would be in no doubt of the supreme power and majesty of the ruler of the country that they were about to enter.
Ramesses II was trying to send out a message here to anybody who was sort of at the edge of his empire. You know, to build something on that scale is a very powerful statement of the strength, not just of Ramesses II himself personally, but of the empire, the country, of the armies, of the gods, the whole package.
In case anyone didn't get his message, Ramesses the Great hammered it home by having images of captive prisoners of war carved at his feet, tied up with rope and kneeling before him. The theme continues inside the temple, which is dominated by a row of 8 colossal statues depicting Ramesses the Great as a god, in the form of Osiris, lord of the underworld. On the temple's walls, Ramesses the Great is shown smiting his enemies, who cower, defeated beneath him. Here he is, triumphant on his chariot, with a bow and arrow at the Battle of Kadesh in modern-day Syria. Here, he smites one enemy while he crushes another's head in the dust. And here, he mercilessly plunges his spear into the heads of a group of his enemies who foolishly dare to stand against him.
The Egyptian mentality, the Egyptian worldview demanded that Pharaoh should be a great, triumphant, dominant character in his own country and beyond. And Ramesses the Great, arguably, more than any other pharaoh, fulfills that role. If the ancient Egyptian worldview demanded that a pharaoh behave and achieve things in a particular way, he's top of the class.
Taken as a whole, Abu Simbel's 3,200-year-old temple is undoubtedly one of the most spectacular of all ancient Egypt's monumental buildings. Remarkably, however, the mountain surrounding Abu Simbel Temple, as we see it today, isn't real. It's a modern recreation, fitted together piece by piece during a massive archaeological rescue operation in the 1960s. As the result of the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, Abu Simbel's original location on the banks of the River Nile became submerged beneath Lake Nasser. So UNESCO spent $40 million moving the entire temple 200 feet up to higher ground.
The moving of the temples of Abu Simbel, and actually a number of other temples from that area of Egypt, is one of the great engineering feats of the late 20th century.
Amazingly, the original temple was sawn up into over 1,000 blocks, weighing up to 30 tons each, and then reassembled into an artificially constructed mountain, exactly matching how the original temple looked.
So, to do that, I think it was an extraordinary achievement, and we're very lucky that it was possible, because to have lost a monument like that underneath the waters of Lake Nasser would have been a tragedy.
Apart from Abu Simbel, Ramesses the Great constructed many other magnificent temples throughout Egypt. But he built probably the greatest of them all in ancient Egypt's capital city of Waset, today known as Luxor. Luxor today is just a medium-sized provincial town, but back in its ancient heyday from around 1500 to 1000 BC, it was one of the biggest, wealthiest and most powerful cities in the world. At the center of the great city, Luxor Temple was reached along a grand avenue of sphinxes nearly 2 miles long. Although it was built over a period of around 150 years by many different pharaohs, including Tutankhamun, Luxor Temple was mostly completed by Ramses the Great, and as was his custom, he stamped his distinctive mark on it by erecting huge statues of himself throughout the temple. At the temple entrance, Ramesses erected a pair of massive obelisks, just one of which remains today. Standing 80 feet high and weighing 250 tons, it was made from Egypt's toughest granite, so it would last for eternity. As a result, despite thousands of years exposed to the elements, its hieroglyphic inscriptions glorifying Ramesses and the gods are remarkably well preserved. The only source of the top-quality granite from which this and almost all ancient Egyptian obelisks were made was a quarry on the banks of the Nile at Aswan, nearly 150 miles upriver from Luxor.
I think we have to remember that every individual obelisk is a massive single piece of often very, very heavy stone. They would be very difficult to quarry, very difficult to free from the natural bedrock. You've then got the problem of transporting an enormously heavy chunk of rock, hundreds of kilometres. All of this was a massive undertaking, and to have achieved what they did in erecting these obelisks in those places was a very considerable technical achievement, and shouldn't be underestimated.
Part of the reason that obelisks were erected was simply to adorn a temple and make it look more beautiful, but they also had a very specific function.
Obelisks are solar monuments. The idea is that in some sense they're a conduit for sunlight from the sky down to the earth. We know the Egyptians have a very clear idea that sunlight can physically charge, like a battery, statues of the gods. We know that as a concept that's recorded in different texts. And so the obelisks, in some sense, harness the power of the sunlight, harness the divine power of the gods, and bring it into the temple.
The key part of the obelisk was actually the triangular pinnacle of it, which would normally have been gilded to reflect the sun's rays.
In the same way that the top of the pyramids are thought to have been gilded, the tip of Luxor Temple's original pair of obelisks are believed to have been covered with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, thus physically charging the temple with the supreme power and divine light of the sun god. Not only were Luxor Temple's obelisks once lit up like shining beacons, but the entire temple originally looked very different from how we see it today. When it was first built, Luxor Temple, like all of ancient Egypt's temples, was brightly painted like this stylized representation with vivid colors, which today have almost completely faded away after thousands of years under the bright Egyptian sun. The ancient Egyptians designed their architecture to be symmetrical, so it's a great pity that Ramesses the Great's obelisk now stands alone, unbalancing the entrance to the temple. The missing obelisk was taken away by the French in the 1830s and now stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris.
Obelisks always seem to be very attractive to foreign imperial powers, and a large majority of the obelisks in Egypt which were still standing in Roman times were taken away by the Roman emperors.
Today, there are as many ancient Egyptian obelisks standing in Rome as there are in all of Egypt. The most famous of these is the obelisk in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, which was originally brought to Rome by the Emperor Caligula. The most significant of Rome's obelisks, however, is this one in Lateran Square, the biggest of all the ancient Egyptian obelisks that are still standing in the world today, originally 120 feet tall and weighing over 450 tons. Even this huge obelisk, however, pales into insignificance compared to the size of a gigantic obelisk that still remains today in the ancient granite quarry at Aswan, where almost all of ancient Egypt's obelisks were originally cut. At around 140 feet in length and estimated to weigh a staggering 1,200 tons, the unfinished obelisk is nearly 3 times as heavy as any other ancient Egyptian obelisk. If it had been successfully quarried and erected, it would undoubtedly have been one of the ancient world's greatest engineering achievements.
We can consider it one of the wonders of Egypt. We can compare it with the pyramids. It's one of the wonders of the ancient world and modern world.
Remarkably, like all obelisks, the unfinished obelisk was cut out of the extremely hard granite bedrock using the simplest stone tools. One of the few stones tougher than granite is dolerite, and small dolerite boulders like these were used as hammers by hundreds of workers, who over months of back-breaking labor gradually wore down the granite by pounding away on all sides of the obelisk. Unfortunately, however, when the formidable job of quarrying the giant stone was almost finished, the obelisk suddenly cracked.
It would have been a disaster, an enormous amount of effort and investment that came to nothing. And this great dream of this huge obelisk just gone like that.
Before work to quarry the obelisk had been given the go-ahead, test pits like this had been dug deep into the bedrock to make sure that the area of rock chosen for the obelisk wouldn't crack. Whoever it was who approved this location obviously made a big mistake.
The Pharaoh will not be happy because he needed his obelisk in front of his temple. I think the man who made the mistakes in the test pits, the chief of the engineers, maybe something terrible had happened to him. And I think the end of this man, he will be punished. He will be imprisoned or maybe killed.
Egypt's pharaohs only publicized their successes, never acknowledging their failures. So which pharaoh it was who commissioned the unfinished obelisk will probably never be known. Experts, however, are almost all agreed about where it was to be erected if it hadn't cracked. After somehow being hauled out of the quarry and loaded onto river barges, it would almost certainly have been transported down the Nile to the biggest and most magnificent temple in all of ancient Egypt. Located in ancient Egypt's capital, near Luxor Temple, Karnak Temple was built over a period of more than 1,000 years. Constructed on a massive scale, it was at the center of a vast religious complex covering more than a square mile.
Karnak was the nearest thing the Egyptians had to a national shrine. The principal deity worshipped was Amun-Re, king of the gods, who was a combination of a local deity, Amun, with Re, the sun god, whose worship goes back to the earliest days of Egyptian history.
At the center of Amun-Re's great temple, the so-called hypostyle hall, which covers over 50,000 square feet, is so enormous that even today, well over 3,000 years after it was built, it's said to be the largest room of any religious building in the world. Mostly built by Ramesses the Great's father, Seti I, the hypostyle hall's 134 columns, rising up to 70 feet high, originally supported a roof long since collapsed. Back when it still had its roof and was in use for worship, the hypostyle hall would certainly have looked very different. Dimly lit, and no doubt full of spiritual atmosphere as the temple's priests went about their business.
In its heyday, it probably would have supported thousands of staff, both at priestly level and also at the large number of people who were doing all the services required for that. Butchers, bakers, carpenters, maintenance people and so on. So it was a massive institution.
Just outside the hypostyle hall stand two great obelisks. The last one still standing of a remarkable number of obelisks that once adorned Karnak Temple. It's believed there were once 17 obelisks here, raised by many different pharaohs in honor of Amun-Re. There would have been 18 obelisks here, of course, if the gigantic unfinished obelisk, still in the quarry at Aswan, had successfully made it here. Around 1,000 years or so after Karnak's two remaining obelisks were raised and the hypostyle hall was constructed, the very last part of Karnak Temple was built, the so-called first pylon, which today forms the temple entrance. Unusually, the gateway isn't decorated with any hieroglyphic inscriptions or images of the gods and the pharaoh who built it, probably Nectanebo I, whose reign began in 379 BC. The explanation for why the gateway remained unfinished, no doubt, is that just 5 years after Nectanebo's coronation, Egypt was invaded by the Persian Empire. The Persians subsequently ruled over Egypt for a brief period, but they were soon defeated in battle by Alexander the Great, who added Egypt to his vast empire in 332 BC. Alexander the Great died just 10 years later, but Greek rule of Egypt continued for another 300 years or so, first under one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy, and then under his descendants, known generally as the Ptolemies.
The Ptolemies realised very early on that if they were to be successful in taking the country over, then they were going to have to rely on more than just military might. They were going to have to win the kind of the hearts and minds, if you like, of the Egyptian people. And in order to do that, they were going to have to become truly Egyptian pharaohs.
One of the key parts of playing a proper pharaoh amongst the Ptolemaic kings was to support religion.
To honor the ancient Egyptian gods, the Ptolemies built many magnificent temples. Constructed relatively recently in ancient Egyptian terms, around 2,000 years ago, one of these Ptolemaic temples in particular is today considered the best preserved of all ancient Egyptian temples. Although Edfu Temple was built over 1,000 years later than Luxor Temple and most of Karnak Temple, for example, it still has very recognizably the same traditional ancient Egyptian architectural design. What makes Edfu Temple unique is how well its interior, in particular, has been preserved. Still covered by its original roof, it provides the best idea we can get of how a temple would have looked in ancient Egyptian times.
The basic concept of an Egyptian temple was that it got darker the deeper you got into that temple. That also reflected on the level of access as well, that as it got darker, fewer and fewer people were entitled to be there. So therefore, by the time you get into the sanctuary, it is only the senior priests who are allowed in to attend to the gods' daily needs.
Gods in ancient Egypt required what living people required. They wanted shelter, they wanted food, they wanted drink, they wanted entertainment, they wanted to be dressed nicely, to wear jewellery. And so temple ritual in pharaonic Egypt was designed to provide for the gods' needs at different points during the day.
They would be fed in the morning, noon and in the evening, and thus the offerings which were placed in front of them were the appropriate foods for that. So you would get meat, vegetables, wine and beer. In some cases, you might actually have a live animal brought and sacrificed. It seems fairly clear that the various offerings, as soon as the god had taken the spiritual element, headed off to the kitchens to provide dinner for the priesthood and the rest of the temple staff.
The particular god to whom Edfu Temple was dedicated and who received all these offerings was the falcon god Horus. God of the sky and protector of the pharaoh, Horus was just one of a huge number of different gods that were worshipped in ancient Egypt. Apart from Horus, many other Egyptian gods were also represented in animal form, such as Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, Khnum, the ram-headed god of creation, Khepri, the god of rebirth, depicted as a scarab beetle, and Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of the Nile and fertility. In temples often specifically dedicated to their worship, each of these gods were usually depicted with an animal head on a human body. Sometimes, however, the gods were shown in full animal form, and in addition, temples sometimes kept one real live animal that was venerated as the god's representative on earth. After they died, these sacred animals were then mummified and buried nearby by the temple priests, so that as living gods they might thrive for eternity in the afterlife. Mummified crocodiles are remarkable enough, but the ancient Egyptians' most astonishing sacred animal cult required the mummification of much bigger animals, bulls. Discovered buried beneath the desert sands by French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette in 1851, the Serapeum at Saqqara is a vast underground catacomb that once contained the mummified bodies of more than 20 sacred bulls.
The Serapeum is one of the most impressive sites in Egypt. What you encounter are these incredibly large, heavy stone sarcophagi, so solid stone coffins, that were carved of single pieces of granite, so incredibly heavy stone, dragged down into these underground galleries that go on for hundreds of metres under the sands of Saqqara.
The so-called Apis bulls that were buried in the massive sarcophagi, which weigh as much as 70 tons, were regarded as divine manifestations of one of ancient Egypt's most powerful gods, Ptah, the creator of the universe.
The bulls, during their lifetimes, would have lived in a special stall in the Ptah temple at Memphis. There was a template, if you like, of what an Apis bull should look like. It would be a certain set of markings. When the bull died, priests would be sent round Egypt to try and find a bull calf born after the death of the old bull, which had the same markings.
In a very real sense for the ancient Egyptians, the Apis bull is a god on earth, like the Pharaoh. And once the bull dies, it is very important that it is specially prepared and mummified in a royal fashion. And part of that ritual is elaborate decoration. And so it's embellished with jewellery.
Probably there would have been a gold mask over its face, silver horns, a very, very elaborately prepared mummy.
All of the priceless golden treasures that once adorned the sacred bulls, however, had vanished by the time the Serapeum was discovered in 1851. They were probably stolen soon after the Serapeum fell into disuse, once Ptolemaic Egypt was defeated by the Roman Empire and Christianity arrived. The robbers, of course, would have wanted to profit from the Apis bull's rich golden treasures, but the early Christians were also eager to smash what they saw as the false idols of pagan ancient Egyptian religion. By the 6th century AD, all of ancient Egypt's pagan temples and cult centers had been destroyed or closed down. All, that is, except one temple, which was the very last place in Egypt where the ancient gods were worshipped. Beautifully located on a small island in the middle of the Nile near Aswan, close to ancient Egypt's southern border, Philae Temple was dedicated to one of the country's most important deities, the goddess Isis.
Isis is the quintessential mother goddess. She is the mother of the god Horus. Her cult is still very important well into the Roman period, right in the south of Egypt, where the life-giving waters of the Nile first emerge in the annual flood, the inundation, and so the cult would be associated with the life-giving properties of the water as much as with the life-giving properties of the goddess.
The ancient Egyptians believed Isis's tears of sorrow for her dead husband were the cause of the Nile's annual flood, which was of vital importance to the nation, since a good harvest depended on it. So it's ironic that, just like the temple at Abu Simbel, the original location of the temple of Philae was flooded by the Nile when the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s. Again, just like at Abu Simbel, in order to save Philae from the rising waters, UNESCO launched a hugely ambitious rescue operation in the 1970s to move the temple to higher ground. First protected from the surrounding waters and then dismantled piece by piece into nearly 50,000 separate blocks of stone, the temple was finally painstakingly reassembled on a higher island a few hundred yards away. Just like at Abu Simbel, the saving of Philae by UNESCO was a remarkable achievement, and today the temple's appearance very closely resembles how it used to look before the 1970s on its original, now submerged island. The temple, however, does look significantly different today to how it would have originally appeared when it was first built back in the 4th century BC. The reason was the iconoclastic fervour of the early Christians.
When Christianity triumphed in Egypt, as also in other parts of the ancient world, the austere monotheism of Christianity was completely incompatible with the lush polytheism of the ancient religion.
Pharaonic temples are replete with images of gods again and again and again and again. That sense of divinity changed, and human nature can be very volatile, and changes in ideas caused people to attack some of the figures.
The last major temple in Egypt where the ancient gods were worshipped, Philae, was transformed into a church in around 536 AD. Christian crosses were carved instead of reliefs of the ancient gods, and the Christian Eucharist was celebrated at this altar set up in the ancient temple's entrance hall. With worship of the ancient Egyptian gods now forbidden throughout the land, Egypt's historic hieroglyphic language was also now shunned and forgotten.
Although hieroglyphs were simply a writing system, they were so intimately related to the ancient religion that once the ancient religion had gone, hieroglyphs were no longer used.
Hieroglyphic script in the ancient terminology is God's words, divine words. So once the gods ceased to be worshipped, hieroglyphic script became obsolete.
Poignantly, the last known hieroglyphs ever carved in Egypt are here at Philae. Written by a scribe 150 years or so before the temple was turned into a church, the inscription even gives the exact date that it was written. The 24th of August, 394 AD.
The last dated hieroglyphic text is a very poor thing. The form of the signs isn't very good, and it's clear by now that only a handful of people are able to even sort of mark out this kind of thing, let alone carve it to any kind of decent standard.
Soon after this final inscription was carved, nobody was left alive who understood the ancient language at all. As a result, the huge number of hieroglyphs on Egypt's temples were unreadable for nearly 1,500 years, until the hieroglyphic language was finally deciphered in the early 19th century, following the discovery of the Rosetta Stone.
The ability to read hieroglyphic texts, which really developed from the 1820s onwards, made a huge difference to our understanding. Prior to the ability to actually read ancient Egyptian again, all we could do was work from classical authors, the Bible, some Islamic writers as well, which produced a picture of ancient Egypt we now know was completely and utterly wrong.
Following the decipherment of hieroglyphs, many of the previously mysterious secrets of ancient Egyptian civilization now began to be unlocked. At the same time, many of Egypt's greatest ancient temples, which had been hidden for thousands of years beneath the drifting desert sands, began to be rediscovered and excavated. Ever since, ancient Egypt has captured the world's imagination. Successfully enduring for over 3,000 years, it was perhaps the greatest and most magnificent of all the ancient civilizations, with a huge influence on us even today.
Ancient Egypt sets the standard in art, architecture, literature, language, writing. The first achievement in this, that, and the other was in ancient Egypt. It was the center of the world for such a long time. And in so many ways, many of our achievements ever since are built on the achievements of the Egyptians.